So welcome back. Yesterday we began laws regarding inserts that are made into the Amida, whether it be mentioning rain or asking for rain. We'll speak about Ya'aleh v'Yavo and finally about fasts. So let's first start by continuing on the topic of rain. So we're now moving along through the morning prayers and we're dealing with insertions into the Amida. We spoke about mentioning rain yesterday, how we start mentioning rain on the Shmini Atzeres, which is on the 8th day of Sukkot, and we conclude mentioning rain on the first day of Pesach. That's as far as mentioning rain. And then we spoke about what happens if you forgot to mention rain or if you mentioned it out of place. So in short, if you forgot to mention rain, if you said nothing, then you would have to repeat the Amidah. If you said V'sein Tal Lamotar, which some say, if you said Moirid Hatol, then you would not have to repeat the Amidah. If you mentioned rain in the wrong season, then according to all opinions, you would be required to repeat the Amida. That's pretty much a summary of what we learned yesterday. And today we'll continue to discuss not mentioning rain, but asking for rain, which comes in the middle of the Amida, right after the blessing for health. The very next blessing is asking Hashem for produce, and that's where we ask for rain in the right season. So let's learn about that. That takes us to Halakha number 5. Okay, so just a little intro over here by the translators. The 6th bracha of Shemona Esrei begins Baruch Aleinu. It's a prayer for bountiful harvest and ample rainfall for the earth and its inhabitants. Therefore, when the season for rain arrives, we add a special prayer asking for rain, dew and rain, Talabatar. We begin to say Talabatar in the Amidah of Ma'ariv on the 60th day after the Tishrei or fall season, which is nowadays around the 5th of December. That's when we start actually asking for rain. 4th or the 5th of December, and it is said until the first day of Pesach. So we start mentioning rain a little earlier at the end of Sukkot, but we don't want to start asking for rain yet because people need a chance to get home. So we'll see in Israel it's a little different. I'm not sure he mentions that. In Israel, on the 7th of Cheshvan, which is approximately 2 weeks after the end of Sukkot, well, a little more, just over 2 weeks, they start asking for rain because by then all the people in Israel have gotten home and they're not going to be stuck on the roads. And outside of Israel, we wait until the beginning around the 4th or the 5th of December, which follows the sun, and that's when we start asking for rain. So we start by mentioning rain a little earlier, and then we ask for rain from the 4th or 5th of December up until the first day of Pesach. Those are the dates. Now, what happens if you made a mistake? This will be relevant. It's always relevant because although we won't be changing in the very near future, because the next time we'll be changing will be on the 5th of December, which is in a couple of months. But let's learn the laws. So if you made a mistake and you forgot to ask Hashem for rain, you forgot to say Talamatar. So just for those that just joined us, earlier we spoke about mentioning rain and now we're talking about asking for rain. So you forgot to ask for rain. So if you remembered before ending the bracha, that bracha where we ask for rain, then you would add it in wherever you remember. So you would say before the close of the bracha, V'sein Tal Lamotar lebracha al pnei adama v'sameinu. Please give us rain, dew and rain as a blessing on the face of the earth. And then you'd conclude the bracha, Baruch atah Hashem v'barach hashanim. If you didn't remember until after completing the bracha, then you can continue along and add that in the Shema Koleinu prayer, which is just before Moedim, a little before Moedim. Just before we say, Reikav al teshivenu, Hashem, do not leave us empty-handed, that would be a place where you could add in V'sein Tal Lamotar lebracha. I think today they have this actually written in the Siddur. If you look in the sections where it has that insert asking for rain, it should give you a footnote where you could go probably to a page at the back of the book where it will give instructions what to do, because if this happens in the middle of the Amida, you can't exactly go and look it up in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch at that moment. Okay. If you did not remember then, but only after you said Baruch Atah Hashem, as long as you didn't yet say the word Hashem, you just said Baruch Atah, you could still add in V'sein Talamatar. But if you did not realize that you forgot to add Talamatar until after you completed the bracha of Shemaya Tefillah, then you've got to go all the way back to Halakha No and go in order from there. If you did not remember until you finished the Amida, until you said Yiyul Ratzon, you'd have to repeat the Amida. So let's give a little bit of logic to this. So we're asking for rain, and we've got to ask for rain in the appropriate place. There's the most appropriate place to ask for rain is in the blessing that speaks about giving us produce. But if we miss that, then there's a second opportunity to ask for rain, and that would be in the blessing Shema Koleinu, where we could ask for any of our needs. We'd be able to stop there and ask for rain as well. If we miss that second opportunity, then it's out of place, and so therefore we need to return to the most appropriate place for this blessing, which is Barech Aleinu, and then the Amida has to be said in order. As we mentioned earlier, the wording that the rabbis instituted was all based on mystical reasons and Kabbalistic dimensions to it. Every word of the Amida draws down godliness in a unique way, and it has to be done in order. And so if we missed both opportunities to ask for rain, since we must ask for rain because this is an essential need, then you would have to go back to the point that you forgot it, its primary position, which is in Barech Aleinu, in that blessing, asking just after the blessing for health. And you would have to then go in order because, as I've just mentioned, you cannot skip around in the middle of the Amida. Okay, that's if you forgot to ask. What happens if you asked when you weren't supposed to? So it's pretty much the same laws, because as much as we need rain when we need it, rain is a curse when we don't need it. That's the general halachic perspective. And therefore, if you mentioned rain, if you ask for rain at a time where it's actually counterproductive, then that needs to be corrected as well. That's what he says in section number 7. If you made a mistake during the summer in Israel and added Talamatar asking for rain, then you need to go back to the beginning of that blessing and repeat it without that request. That way you take it out. But if you didn't realize that you added Talamatar until after you said the Yiyul Ratzon, meaning up until the end of the Amida, then you would have to repeat the Amida, because as we said, asking for rain at the wrong time is counterproductive, and that means the Amida wasn't said in the way it was meant to be, and it needs to be repeated because it needs to be done in order. Okay, one final discussion is what happens if you're not sure what you did. You're not sure if you did ask or you didn't ask. Unfortunately, it happens to too many of us that, or maybe I'll just speak for myself, that I could be so used to the words that I could actually forget to concentrate. Concentration takes effort. And so I'm actually not sure what I said. If I said the wrong thing, that's a problem. If I said the right thing, then that's good. And I'm not sure what I said. So what do I do? So he says like this. Then you've got to follow what you've accustomed yourself to do, what your habit is at that point. So if you are in doubt about whether you added Mashiach Baruch or not, then if 30 days have passed since the change, meaning you already said the Amida 90 times, because we daven 3 times a day, then it can be assumed that you probably got it right by virtue of habit. If the doubt arose within or before 30 days elapsed, then you'd have to repeat the Amida, because we'll assume that you didn't yet develop the new habits. You didn't yet do it 90 times, and therefore you probably still did it the way you were doing it for the last 6 months, which is wrong, and therefore the Amida would be repeated. The same rule applies to Talamatar. If the doubt arose after you already prayed 90 Amidas, we presume you did it right. But if it's less than 90, then we presume you did it wrong. And the reason he says 90 Amidas and he doesn't say 30 days is because we only ask for rain 6 days a week. On Shabbos, we don't ask for rain. We mentioned rain at the beginning, but we don't ask for our needs on Shabbos. The rabbis wanted to keep the Amida short, and so therefore the Amida, instead of having the 19 regular blessings, it's down to 7. Since it's down to only 7 blessings, so we don't ask for rain. As I said, they wanted to keep the Amida short. So therefore, you'll need more than 30 days, or you'll need 30 days of weekday davenings, meaning excluding Shabbos. Okay. Number 9. So that was all. Yes.
When you say you must repeat the Shemona Esrei, do you repeat it at the point where you remembered you didn't do it, or did do it, or do you wait till you've completely finished davening and then redo it?
That's a great question. But really, if we look back at what we studied, then we'll see that he spoke about repeating the whole Amida only once you finish the Amida. But as long as you're still in the middle of the Amida, then you go back to the beginning of that blessing and you go forward from there. That's as far as the 7th blessing, the blessing where we ask for rain. But as far as the 3rd blessing or 2nd blessing where we mentioned rain, we said the first 3 blessings are a unit. And so if you finish that blessing, blessing number 2, and you realize you forgot to correct yourself, then you'd have to go back to the beginning of the Amida, because you're still right near the beginning, and those first 3 blessings are like one opening section. So you go back to the beginning of that section, which would be the beginning of the Amida.
But one could also remember it at another point after you finish the Amida completely, but you haven't finished davening. That's
Correct.
what I'm asking. Do you stop what you're doing, so you don't do Aleinu or wherever you are, and you go back and do the Amida, or do you complete everything until you're completely finished and then go back and do the Amida?
I'm not sure of the answer to your question. I stand to be corrected. I think that you repeat it right away before continuing with the rest of the prayers.
So the moment you remember. So if you remember while you're still doing Amida, then there's certain things we've learned. And if you might have finished Amida and gone on to the next thing, and then, oh my gosh, I forgot to do it. Then you've got to quickly go back and redo the Amida.
Correct. I mean, if you're in the middle of a blessing or a verse, I would say to finish the verse or blessing that you're in the middle of.
If you're davening in a minyan at shul or on Zoom or whatever, you're then going to be out of sync with the other people. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, I'm just trying to get grip of where what it does.
It could even be rather embarrassing, because you'll kind of stick out as a sore thumb where everybody's sitting down for the repetition of the Amida, moving on, and you're starting your Shemona Esrei as well. But I believe that is what is done. I believe you don't wait. You repeat it right away.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So we have to section number 9, which deals with, this is a little bit more far-fetched, but we'll go through it quickly. So there's a double mistake over here. You've really had a bad night's sleep and you're really confusing things. Like things are just completely upside down, but it can happen to the best of us. And it's actually a beautiful lesson that the Torah is not written for the tzaddik, for the saint. The Torah has instructions to every person in every situation that they find themselves. This is a beautiful lesson in our service of God that we could take from this chapter. This whole chapter, or a large discussion of this chapter, is what happens when people mess up. And the Torah gives instructions. This is how you rectify the situation. So one shouldn't ever think, oh, I'm off the rails, now I'm on my own. One should always realize that the Torah has guidance for a person in every situation that they find themselves, even if they've messed up. So that's a nice life lesson we could take from these laws in our day-to-day service of Hashem. That whatever situation we find ourselves, Hashem has, the Torah and Hashem has guidance for us in that exact situation. So here we go. This is the big fashla over here. So you earn at Ma'ariv on the first night of Pesach. Okay. Now, what was your first mistake? It was the first night of Pesach, but instead of davening the special Amidah for the first night of Pesach, you davened a weekday Amidah, like a regular weeknight. And you realize this after you began that middle blessing, which we only say during the weekday, Halakha No, where we ask for rain. Okay. Now the halacha is that even having begun a bracha in error, you should complete that bracha. Okay, so that's a general principle. If on Shabbos you have a mistake, start davening the weekday davening. and you said a weekday blessing in your middle of that blessing, and then suddenly you realize, hey, I'm in the wrong place in the siddur, you would conclude that blessing. Because as I mentioned, the primary reason we don't ask for our needs on Shabbos from a halachic perspective is to keep the davening not too long. So therefore you're not going to get cut off. If you're in the middle of asking for rain or that blessing where we ask for sustenance, then you would conclude the bracha. So he says conclude the bracha, but don't yet add talubater. Don't mention rain. Even though the official changeover will only be the following morning or after Pesach, or after Yom Tov, I should say, because as long as it's Yom Tov, we're not doing a weekday davening. So the first time we'll make that changeover for a weekday davening will be on the first day of Chol HaMoed, which is 2 days later. He says, since Pesach has already come and you are accidentally davening that weekday davening, then you don't add Talabatar. Since the community isn't saying it either, why are they not saying it? Because they're not davening that Amida altogether. They're davening a different Amida. Okay. If the She'ela petition, that is a day that we begin to pray or petition Talabatar, falls on Shabbos, and by mistake, again, you daven the weekday davening on Shabbos. So it's Shabbos, but you're davening a weekday davening. And again, you started that bracha. Then again, you did not say Talabatar. Since the congregation has not yet started, an individual always follows the congregation. Okay. So that's somewhat of a far-fetched case, but I said the lesson that we could take from there, that if you think you're really submished and you're davening a weekday davening on Yom Tov for Shabbos, then the Torah has guidance for you there too. So that's all as far as rain is concerned. So we've spoken about mentioning rain in the second blessing of the Amidah, and we've spoken about asking for rain, and I think it's maybe the seventh blessing, the one that we ask for sustenance, just ask Barei Chaleinu, just ask after we ask for health. Now we talk about, what about Ya'alev Yavo? Ya'alev Yavo is a beautiful prayer, which comes just before we say Modim, a little earlier than that in the Ritzei prayer, and it is said on special occasions whenever we would be going to the temple to bring an offering. So since we're not able to bring that offering, we say, Hashem, please allow us to have that temple back so that we could go ahead and bring those offerings again soon. Ya'alev, Yavo, Yagia. May we soon be able to ascend and come and reach, and a whole lot of words all expressing how we want to be able to go back to the temple. So Rosh Chodesh, we would bring an offering for Rosh Chodesh. So we have this insert, Ya'alev Yavo, that asking Hashem that we should have the Beis HaMikdash once again on Pesach, on Sukkot, on Shavuos, and all the Yom Tovim when special offerings would be brought, and we're not able to bring those offerings. We ask Hashem, please let us go back and have the temple. And what happened if you forgot to mention that? So this is also an important part of the Amidah, and we'll see it depends on the nature of that particular prayer. So if you forgot to add, you know what, maybe we'll run through this and the rest of the laws, not tomorrow. We're not going to have our regular class tomorrow since it's Erev Tisha B'Av, neither Thursday. So please God, next week we'll conclude the rest of the laws of inserts into the Amidah on Monday, please God. So thanks for joining us and wishing you a wonderful evening.